Sweet. Hi everyone, this is Abby Fuller again. We're picking up with part 2 of our web series on Dockerizing a web app. If you didn't join us last week, a quick recap of our progress. So basically, we have an app. I did not write it. My coworker Randall Hunt wrote it, and it's really cool. It talks about one of the worst trains ever, which is the 7 train, and it's basically just a really simple Python app that returns whether the 7 train is running or not. So we spent last week, we talked a little bit about the basics of a Docker file. We talked about some basic Docker commands. We talked about the app. And so now for part 2, we're going to talk about a couple more Docker commands building on the ones that we learned last week. So last week we talked about building an image, starting an image, stopping an image, and listing the images that we're running. And we're going to go one step further this time, and we're going to talk about how to both run the image, and then we're going to talk about how to push an image to a remote. And then in order to push that to the remote, we're going to do some AWS setup first. So we're going to talk about how to work with ECR, which is the container registry. So we're going to go through that. We are going to build our image again. We're going to test just to make sure that it still works. And then if everything looks good, we'll push our first image out to the registry. As always, feel free to stop me if you have any questions. It's for you guys. Some cool announcements, by the way, today around endpoints for load balancers. So Elastic Load Balancing now supports both host-based routing, and you get extra rules for your application load balancer. So I know that a couple people last week mentioned that they wanted to see the ability to have more rules than before. So conveniently enough, maybe we just make announcements in time for me to stream on Twitch, which is cool. In any case, some cool stuff there. Next week in part 3, we'll actually do the rest of the AWS setup. So we'll go through, we'll create the ALB itself. We'll talk about security groups and VPCs. And we'll do our initial cluster setup, which is going to build us up in a nice place so that the week after that, we'll be able to push our final Dockerized version of Randall's app out to our ECS cluster. A comment from Burned Out Geek, is part 1 available for viewing anywhere? I believe you can see old episodes on the twitch.tv/AWS page. So there's a bunch of good stuff from Randall, from Julio, from me. Everything's available on the video dashboard. So go back, watch things. We'll do a little bit more of a quick summary of what we did last week also. So we'll recap really quickly. Quantum Information says we need more chicks coding. I agree. Definitely always looking for more women to do this. It's fun. Okay, in any case. So to build on, we'll just kind of do a little mini recap of what we did last week before we start again and this week. You can see my screen, which hopefully you still can. We did only a couple things. So first, we added a line at the bottom of Randall's at the bottom of the app, which is basically that we're running it on port 5000. We did a little bit of host magic, but mostly we worked on our Docker file, and that was new for us. We had at an exciting moment, we learned that you really should not build from Ubuntu latest on a slow internet connection. So you guys can all learn from that. In any case, so we talked about this. I've promised that in the future we're going to go back and we're going to make this a little bit faster, a little bit lighter, because we are not building the most efficient Docker file right now. So a couple of things off the top of my head that I really think that we should do to this in the future. So one, I think we should change the base image that we build from. Yes, especially building from the ISS. We did build from the ISS, and that was cool. And then we had the SpaceX launch. But we're still back with our Ubuntu because we have not gotten to the episode where we're going to make this a lot faster yet. So we're still building from Ubuntu. We talked about maintainer. We talked about run, which for us is we're updating our apps packages, and then we're installing the things we need from Python. We're copying our code over. We're changing the directory that we're working from. We're running pip install to take care of our app-specific requirements. We're exposing that port 5000 that we talked about in our application.py file. And finally, we're running our actual Python commands to run the application itself. So same thing as last week. Off the top of my head, though, maybe a couple things that we should do to this in the future. Change that base package. And especially, I mean, even if it's not just using a really minimal base image, it would be really awesome if we could do even a more Python-specific package. So maybe we do something that already has our Python requirements installed already, right? So something that an image that comes with pip and the Python development packages and build essential. And then we could cut a whole bunch of time off of our build time, because as we're going to find out, as we start working with this and as we only worked locally last weekend, and as we start pushing and pulling this app from our remotes, becomes more and more important and more obvious how slow build times are. So the smaller we can make this, the faster it'll build, and the faster it will point to our remotes. So let's just do a quick test, and we'll see if all of my stuff still works. So if anyone remembers, we can build. We have to first. I'm going to remove our old image. So we removed it, and then we do, if anyone remembers our command, docker build t mta, we're going to build it. So I built this from cache today, which I guess is, if you were joining us last time, this is a nice example of how wonderful caching is. So once everything was cached, it was actually pretty fast. Oh, my terminal's off screen. I have not gotten the hang of all the Twitch windows. Hopefully, thank you for pointing that out, /xf. Hopefully everyone can see my terminal window now. Cool. So we can still build our app. We can still run it, hopefully. So breaking down this command for those of you that are just joining us for the first time, we do docker run. D means attached, so it's running in the background. P is where we're going to put in our port information. So we're doing 5000, which we just covered why we're doing port 5000, but basically it's what we exposed in the Docker file, because that's what we're running our Python server with in our application.py file. So we're going to run it. And look, it runs itself, Docker images, and then we do, so we can see all the ones that I built, and you can see that I was playing around with making this a lot smaller because I can't handle it anymore. Docker PS. So we can see our actual running image right now. So we have the container. I just named it MTA because that's what the subway system is called here. Not a super creative name, I guess. Is my webcam supposed to be showing a chair? Well, I'm sitting in the chair. So do you mean that chair? There's a chair that I'm sitting in, and there's also probably a chair in the background. I'm sitting in one of the AWS offices, so there's definitely some furniture happening here. Okay, so chairs aside, so Docker PS, if you missed this last week, yes. Oh, and Gina says, can I move my video to the bottom right? And I think so. I don't really know how to move my video to the bottom right, but hopefully I did that. Oops. I never really get the hang of OBS. Yeah. So now my video is back with my chair and everything. Someday I feel like someone else should do a class on how to actually use OBS in a way that makes sense for everybody else. And then I'm making it smaller. Yeah. Okay. So can everyone see both me and the terminal screen now? Hopefully the answer is yes. Oh. hopefully it should be, well, it shows up in the bottom right for me. So hopefully everyone can see it. Back to our Docker PS. So that's basically just running that's showing my currently running containers. So we only have one container running right now, which is the same one that we just built. So you can see that Docker gives me the short version of the ID that was created when the container was started. So that's awesome. We'll need that ID to do a lot of things. But in any case, so this is our running container. And then if we go and look at our web browser, which should be this, you can see that, yes, it is running locally on my machine. It's running on port 5000, and Randall's app says that the 7 train is in fact running. I have my doubts, but the MTA says that the 7 train is good to go. So we've established kind of the basics that we covered last week. So how to build a basic Docker file, how to add a base image, how to expose a port. And we've established that our Python base image still runs the same way as last week. We can still start and stop our container, and the Python app itself that we built it from is still working as expected. So now we can move a little bit further ahead to the ECR part of it. So if people haven't worked with registries before, you have a couple of different options here. So when you can run your own registry, which is kind of, I think, doing it on expert level. Or you can use ECR, which is the registry from AWS. You can use Docker Hub. There's some options out there. In this particular case, we're going to use ECR, which requires some setup on our side to make sure that we have ECR going. In order to work with ECR, you need to have an AWS account, and then you need to have an IAM user. And that IAM user should have permissions to work with ECR, so it's Elastic Container Registry. From your AWS console, you can find the ECR dashboard from the EC2 container service section. So we head to our container service section. And then you can see it on the drop down on the left is where our actual repositories are. So I have some repositories, but none of them are what we want for this. So we're going to create a new one. And previous to this, so I did a little setup on my own today. I did create an IAM user, and I gave my IAM user permissions to work with the registries. So I did a little bit of setup. I'm happy to help people if they need some help setting that up themselves. But like any other IAM users, you just give it the least amount of access necessary. So don't create an IAM user that has like admin permissions for all of AWS. Don't give it permissions to like talk to DynamoDB or something. Just a user. It should be able to work with ECS and ECR for the purposes of this demo. But in any case, we're going to create a repository, and then you're also going to want to have the AWS CLI installed. So depends on what kind of operating system you use. There's some good documentation out there from Amazon on how to actually get that working on your local machine. I will put a link in the chat. But so you need your IAM user and you need the AWS CLI installed. But we're going to do this from the console to start with because it's a little bit easier to follow along with. And I would say that I've been working with ECS for a while, and the console first run wizard is really great. And it's not something that was around when I first started working with ECS, but it's something that I kind of saw appear in the last couple of months. But you definitely get more visibility, I think, into what's happening with the ECS, especially because it's really new for a lot of people. The console will show you a little bit more options than the CLI will. I'm a CLI fan. I know that Tryhard is the new Kappa, is making a console screaming face. I feel the same way, but it's a lot easier to follow along with. So we're going to create our repository. It's just the blue button. We're going to call this MTA, so it matches my Docker image, even though that's not super important. I'll make my window a little bigger. But Permissions. So it's giving you a warning here. So it's saying, as the owner, you have access by default. So the caveat here is that no one else has permission but you to access this by default. So if you're working with like a CI or a CD system or a build tool, you'll have to explicitly give IAM users and everyone else permission to work with this registry, which I did not know when I first started it, and I did not understand. But that is the case now, so just a warning. So we've created our MTA registry. We name things intuitively like you would for anything else. It's not a very creative name, but works. It's going to show me the URL for my repository here, but I don't necessarily need to pay attention at this particular step because by popular demand, the next step is going to show all the push and pull commands that I need for my registry. So next step. So we get our little success message. Success is awesome. It gives me my whole repository, and this whole URL is important. So not only have I created the repository, but it's giving me the whole namespace. So what I can't do is just push my Docker image to MTA or to like some other short URL /MTA. I have to specify the whole namespace that I'm pushing my image to. And I think that the only time that ever really gets confusing is that some images are part of like the library on Docker Hub, and those are a little special. But for our purposes, we'll need this whole namespace every time. So working with the AWS CLI, I think, has its own set of instructions. For my particular use case, I only need a couple of these. So I have my ECR get login, and these are all important, but so full content again, and then we're back to the terminal screen. OBS is like maybe one of the most confusing things I've ever used in my life. Okay, so I can do my ECR get login, and it says command not found, which is awesome. Okay, so this is kind of funny, but basically you have to copy and paste this Docker command, and it's terrible, and this is not super intuitive, but basically the result of the AWS ECR get login command is just this, and it's a string that you have to copy and paste, which by hand, it's like, okay, but when you're running this actually online, so like if you're running like, so for example, from your build or from your CL, like from your CI tool, you definitely want to automate this. And the way that I did this in the past was kind of wrapping this in its own little function. So I ran the Docker login, and it basically, I produced that as a variable, and then I echoed that back. That worked really well for me. I guess it wasn't super pretty, but it worked. But in my case, doing it by hand, I have to copy and paste my string. Login succeeded. Apparently we don't use the email string anymore, so I will stop doing that in the future. But this string basically is just authenticating me with my ECR registry. So I've logged into my thing. So now what? If we go back to our registry directions, it says that we should build our Docker image. Thankfully, we've already built our image. I think maybe a good time now to point out some things on Docker tags. So like anything else, it ends up being what works the best for your infrastructure and like what's going to be intuitive for you. I generally don't tag everything with latest. So what Docker does is that it's the default behavior is that if you don't pass it a tag, so if you pass it nothing, you just build your image and then you push it, it'll default to tagging with latest. A couple problems that I can kind of see with tagging everything as latest. One, and the big one, it's not very version controlled. So we want some better version control for our containers. So what we're going to do is, locally is we're just going to tag it with something intuitive for us. So maybe we'll tag with latest, maybe we'll tag with test, but we're just going to tag one thing now. In the future, when you're working with so we talked about this a little bit last week, but basically we're working with containers, we're working with CI, we're working with CD. you're deploying a lot more than you did in the past. So when you had a monolith, you might deploy like maybe once a day, maybe once a week, maybe every couple of weeks. When you have containers and you have microservices, maybe you're just deploying a lot. And that's what I found when I switched from like a monolith to microservices, that I was deploying much more than I ever was before. But you want to automate this stuff. So we automated the deployments with CI/CD, but then it was if I'm tagging all my Docker images as latest, then it makes it really hard for me to go back and debug something later. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to tag things specifically, but leave our general tags. So you ended up tagging each image twice. So when you built a development branch, you'd give 2 tags. You'd tag with the SHA of the build from the CI/CD system, and you'd also tag it with dev for development. So we'd push both those tags, and that gave us 2 things. So one, it let us tie back a version very specifically to that specific SHA. And then since that SHA was kicked off by a specific commit, we could tie it back to a specific commit too, which meant that once we deployed that to ECS, then we could tie back every single deployment back to a specific build, and then in turn back to a specific commit, which is really awesome for debugging purposes, because if you break your service and you know that, like, okay, you just deployed, you can tie back that specific deployment ECS back to the commit that made that deployment. I think that's really powerful, especially when you're working with a number of services. It's really awesome to be able to kind of debug that on the fly with a little bit of help. So that's what we did. But we also wanted to keep the general tags. So for example, local development environments, you don't need to know a specific SHA or a specific tag for the Docker images. You should just be able to work with dev or latest. So basically, if you wanted to build a copy of the production service, you could tag it. You could run everything with the latest images. If you wanted to build kind of from the bleeding edge, you could tag everything you could pull everything from the dev images. So you have both those options there. You have your actual in staging or production where you want to tie back to the build, but then you also have your latest and your dev images. So kind of the best of both worlds, I think, on that one. You always want to tag it. I think if nothing else, pick the tag scheme that works for you. Just don't make it everything latest. You'll regret it in the future when you have a million things and none of them have tags anymore, so they've all been untagged because you can only have one latest. So a word of friendly advice, I guess. So we've already built our image, so we have to do our tags. We're going to tag it with latest, and then we're going to tag it with something else. So we've built this. So we tagged our image already, MTA with our latest, and then we're going to try to push our registry. And I have not actually tested this or not yet, so hopefully it works. Here we go. So here we're pushing all of our layers. And you can see that we did not write this particularly effectively, because look at all the layers that I'm pushing. So it's going to be a little bit slower to push when an initial registry, so that initial push, because honestly, we've never pushed anything, so there's nothing to use from cache. A question from the audience, from Julio, saying, do you guys use public or private repos? I'm guessing it's a question for the other people hanging out in chat. I tend to use private repos for work things, and then public repos for things that I want other people to collaborate for. So I'm a big open source fan. So my repos themselves are private, but if we're talking about like GitHub repos and stuff, I tend to try to keep things public. My ECS repo, though, ECR repo, we did cover this earlier. It is by nature private, which it looks like KP Cricks also pointed out. Thank you. It's by nature private, and it will be hidden to everyone unless you explicitly make it available to people. So we're pushing all of our layers still. Actually, a little bit faster than I expected, so definitely not as bad as last week's deployment from the ISS. But you can still see that like this, we're paying for our kind of bloated base image here. We did not do a lot of work to make this efficient. So we didn't put in a lot of work to make the image small or to reduce the number of build steps. We didn't do that. And imagine if you're deploying this a bunch of times a day, it's going to take a while. It's not super fast. It's going to take us a while to deploy every time. This only took maybe 2 minutes this time, but it's a really lightweight. 2 minutes to deploy a really lightweight Python container should not be the case. So basically, I'm wasting a lot of time waiting for Ubuntu to build, get packages, and push to my remote registry, when really I don't need to be doing that at all. So when we go back and we should make a note of it, and then when we go back and make our image a little bit more effective, we should be able to speed up these deployments a lot. So when we're building at some point when we have lots and lots of images and lots of containers, we should be able to push those a lot faster, and also we'll get a little boost from the cache. So going back to our browser for just a second. So if we're looking at our steps, we have definitely done all of the steps that the wizard recommended us to. So we'll call it done. And then so we can see right here on the console, we can see that we did actually push our actual image. So view all, we only have one tag. Maybe when it shows us our actual size, it's not too terrible, but it's also not great. What I would maybe do at this point is let's test out another tag. So we'll call it Twitch. And we'll call it Twitch again. Oh, and I didn't actually build my container yet. So I have to do something else first. So we'll go back to our console. You can see our tag. We can basically go through the So there's a couple other people hanging out in the background at the loft today. It's closed, but I stole it to stream with. We can't see the bottom of the terminal again. That is because I switched away from my terminal window, just to go back to our console for a second. A couple things to note here. So one, this is the only place that you can go back to get your push commands if you lose them. So if for some reason you lose the endpoint for your registry, this is where you can find it. I think it's probably the only place you can find it. So you can go back here. You'll also notice it's like any other AWS resource. There's an ARN associated with it. Also cool. So right now, a couple of caveats for ECR. You only get up to 1,000 per repository, which has come up for a couple people that, okay, well, I have CI, I have CD, I'm deploying all the time. What if I need more than 1,000? So you can request it. You can get more than that if you need to. You can also look at your permissions here. So I have not added anything specific, and we talked about how you're only granting permissions here. It doesn't come with anything other than for the owner by default. So I have no permissions. So no one else with this AWS account or anyone can pull or push from this registry. It's just me because I own it. This is where you could add them though. So it works just like IAM policies, but you can give access to other IAM users or AWS accounts this way. And I'm pretty sure there might be a way to do it through the CLI, but the CLI does not have quite all the functions as the console does for ECR and ECS. Basically, we're only using this for a test right now, but if you want anyone else to be able to use it, you'll need to add a permission statement at some point. So you can see the image that we made. My computer is making angry noises at me. So we pushed our image, so we've caught up. There's a little bit of prep work that maybe we need to do um, to make sure that we're ready for next week. So a couple things. So the goal for this is we're going to end up deploying our finished container to ECS. So there's some AWS setup that we need to do next week. And then we'll also need to make sure that we do. We need to check some things in our Python app to make sure that we have everything that we need for our security groups. I think if you're just joining us, we've covered a couple of things so far today. So we've recapped last week for people that are just joining us, and then we've talked about a couple new Docker commands. So we've talked about Docker build again, but we've also talked about Docker tag, and we've talked about Docker push. We've also gone through how to create a registry on ECR, which is Amazon's container registry. Quantum Information says both, I feel like signing up for Amazon Prime. I love Amazon Prime. And also, isn't Docker doing Vagrant's job in this video? I'm not sure I follow exactly what you're getting at with this question. This is a different machine than I used last time to demo because I didn't want to have to deal with explaining the networking part, honestly. So I'm just running Docker for Mac, which does take care of a couple little things. So previously, you could only run Docker on OS X inside a virtual machine. You don't quite have to do that anymore. I still really enjoy running Docker through Vagrant, but you can just run Docker for Mac, and it just runs natively on OS X. It's pretty great. You can see it running. You can just install. It's like a disk image through Docker site. But it removes the whole virtual machine part. So I no longer have to either install and run it in a Linux virtual machine or run the Docker toolbox. I still really enjoy the Docker toolbox. It's a little older though, so I'm seeing that the development on Docker for Mac is happening faster than it is for Docker toolbox now. And I think it's just about almost caught up. So there's no need for a Vagrant machine on this computer right now, because I can just run Docker by itself. I thought Docker just deployed small things. So by definition, containers are kind of small, but you can have anything in a container. You can end up with a big container. I think containers lend themselves really nicely, I think, to microservices. So yeah, like maybe I'm downloading and deploying and building maybe a dozen pretty small containers, but it's still Docker's not really doing the deployment part, if that makes sense. So the container is just where it's like a wrapper around the processes that I'm running. So we shared around the Jesse Frizzell article last week. I'll share it around again. A really good article explaining the differences between jails and VMs and containers and things like that. But basically, all the container is like a wrapper. So it's a wrapper around my process, and it lets me run it in a bunch of different places. And the kind of the practical explanation for that is that I ran Randall's Is the 7 train running in a Docker container. So when we wrote that Docker container last week, though, all I really did was wrap his process. Is we added a couple things, and we'll go back to my text editor window. I'm only doing a couple things here. So I'm installing what I need to run my actual app. I'm copying over Randall's code. I'm installing my requirements, but that's it. All the container is a box that's both. It's a wrapper around both Randall's Python process, which is our application.py file, but it has all the requirements that it needs inside the box already. So just providing like a separate little environment to run that process in. It gets the packages it needs, it installs the requirements it needs, and then wraps and runs the process. So as for deploying, we can use whatever tool we want to handle actually deploying that container. And I actually think that that's actually one of the coolest parts about containers at all, right? Is that not only can it run just its own little process, but I can put that container with that process anywhere that I want. So we talked about Vagrant like development environments a little bit, but I can take the same container, so is the 7 train running, and I can run that on a local Vagrant environment. I can run that in a staging ECS environment. I can run that in a production ECS environment. I could actually run that in a production or staging non-ECS environment. Like, that's what's cool about the container. As long as I'm pushing it to a registry that I can access, I can pull and deploy. I can pull that and then deploy that container anywhere else. So Docker won't ever. Well, I'm sure they have tools for it also. But you deploy things however it works for you. All we're doing in the containers is kind of is building and packaging things up for ourselves. So if that makes sense to everyone, we will do our. Okay, so we covered that. We covered how to tag and push things. Question from Anthony WC: will you cover ECS CLI or K8s, which so Kubernetes? Kubernetes, I'm not sure we've put anything together for. We haven't put anything together for kind of a Twitch series. If there's interest, I think it's something that we could definitely cover. Will we cover ECS CLI? We totally can. So in general, I think the reason for showing the console is that there's like a couple things that I think are always, I see that my font is too small. For some reason, it doesn't keep my bigger font size, so I'm going to have to go and change my actual configuration file to keep my jumbo Twitch font size. It does not want to be as big as. Okay, so hopefully this is a little bit better. So as for why, so there's a couple of things that we demo that I'm demoing the console, and I'm generally a CLI kind of person. I think there's a couple of things that are easier for or only possible for ECS and ECR through the console. So one, if you're just using ECS for the first time, I do actually find that the first run wizard is very valuable. It helps you, especially with a lot of the. Not everyone is super into working on the networking side of things, so like making sure that your VPC is set up the right way and making sure you have the right CIDR block. So those are all, I think, for a lot of people, tedious or hard, or maybe you're just doing kind of an independent project, or you're just working on a side project and you're a developer and not really an ops person, and maybe you don't want to have to worry about that stuff. So you can kind of push that off. And the first run wizard will help you with that networking thing. So making sure the VPC is up, helping you deploy a test application. I think it's really valuable. If you've never worked with ECS before, I would suggest checking it out. I wish that it had been around when I started working with ECS, because there was a couple of confusing hours looking at the documentation, being like, how do I work with this? So the CLI, I think, is really awesome when you're anything to automate. I think you definitely want to do it with the CLI. So the ECS and ECR part of the CLI now are part of the generally available CLI. So you don't need to do the preview mode anymore. There's some stuff that you can do here. You can do almost everything this way. I generally find that working with permissions models, so like working with the IAM role or giving my app permissions to talk to my registry, that's always going to be easier through the console. And I like to, and maybe this is former ops person paranoia, but I always like to check things from the console also. So even if I've done something from the CLI, and I think that I've done it correctly and I've done a great job, I still like being able to verify. So I really like the ability to go into the console and look and say, okay, well, here's where I get my push commands if I need them. Here's where I can get my repository URL if I need them. Here's where I can look at all the images that I need them. Because not everyone is always going to be super comfortable working with the CLI. And I think it's nice to have both the options out there, especially, again, if you're working with any permissions models or IAM roles or something like that. I have a much easier time from the console. No shame in my console game. So to cover the CLI really quickly, you have all your options here. You can create. So we haven't really worked in this particular stream. We haven't really worked with ECS too much. We've just worked with ECR and we've worked with Docker locally. But basically, any option that you have for ECS, you can have from the CLI also. So if there's interest, we can do these both ways next week. So we can both show the commands from how you do it from the console in the first run wizard, and then we can work with the CLI also. So I would say that you can do everything through the CLI, but it sometimes takes a couple of calls. So you'll have to both. So, like for example, I can list the container instance, but I'll have to list the container instance, and then I'll need to get an ID or an ARN back, and then I'll need to make a second call with the CLI to get any other information to describe that actual cluster instance. So great for automation. A little bit more work sometimes when you're looking to inspect demos and stuff like this. Is Lightsail just prettified EC2? I can pass around the Lightsail documentation. Basically, kind of a little bit more of an easy way to get started. I will pass around. I think I owe you guys a couple of links, actually. I owe the jails and VMs and container link, which hopefully I'll find again somewhere. I have to Google for it. I should just save it because so many people send me that link every day, and I'm not sure why I don't write it down somewhere. So here's the Lightsail description for those of you that are looking at that. I just love that this guy is wearing a cape, honestly. It's like my favorite documentation page because I wish that I'm also coding right now, and I'm also sitting at a computer. And I feel like the fact that I'm not wearing a cape is shameful for me. So that's the Lightsail one. I owe the containers versus the jails and VMs link also, so I'm going to do that. I visited this all the time, apparently. Here's the blog. Oh, it's not the blog article. I feel like I'm going to just cover I wish I could pin things. There we go. Suxisova says I should get a cape for the next stream. I think you are 100% right. I do have more tattoos, I think, than that guy wearing the cape, so I really think that I could be winning if I also had a cape. So I'm on it. I'm going to make sure that I get a cape next time. I think if we're lucky, maybe we can get Randall and Julio to wear capes also. I think maybe that should be a requirement. Just to stream on Twitch, you need to wear a cape. Okay, so I passed around a couple of links now. We were looking at the CLI really quickly. You can pretty much do anything here. So I do think, like any other service, that the CLI only really starts to help me once I kind of know the calls I want to make already. So if I have my cluster running and I know that I want to make a deployment to one service, I know that I want update service. If I know that I want to run, to take a container out of if I want to take it out of my cluster, I know that I want the container state change, and I can update my instances the same way. So we're going to go through all the ECS clusters options next week, I promise. So this is just a little bit of a preview. We can do the same with ECR. So where I see the ECR, kind of the CLI commands, it's just like anything else. Like automation is really where this works for me. So being able to create a repository is great. I would have a hard time, I think, working with the actual repository policies from here. But what I actually think this would be really cool, and which I guess maybe that will be my next Twitch project, is we'll build this together. But sometimes I do hit over 1,000 images, and what would be really cool is maybe we should just write something that like batch deletes a bunch of images from an ECR registry just for fun. But in any case, there's a set of ECR commands like there are for any other service. You can work with ECR this way, so we could have created a repository this way. We can get our login token, which is the call that we made with the CLI before. So we actually have made a CLI call already today. We did our AWS ECR get login for a specific region. So we did make a CLI call today. We made a lot of CLI calls. We both got our login and we pushed our image, and those are all CLI calls. The only thing that we didn't do was create the registry itself, which we could do. So it looks like it's create repository. So AWS ECR create repository test. Oh, and it looks like, as always, I never managed to actually do the right number of dashes. There actually probably is an AWS branded towel, I feel like, or a cape. So basically now we can see Abby learn about all the flags that she's forgetting. So there we go. As requested, yet another ECR CLI call. So we created a new repository. I named it Twitch because, as we've already discovered, I am not great at naming things. If we go back to our all repositories, we now have our new Twitch repository. So you can do anything with the CLI that you can do with the console. To each their own. I will make a note that next week when we walk through some of these ECS setup steps to make sure that we use the CLI just as often. Okay, so if you're just joining us, our last little recap before we sign off for the night, but basically where we're at with our app. We've covered how to build a Docker file. We've covered why the Docker file we built wasn't awesome, and we'll talk about how we should slim that down in the future. We've added some stuff. To Randall's Python app to make it work for Docker, and now we've been able to both build and test our image locally, and we tested it in my browser also, that we could see it running on localhost port 5000. And then we've created two repositories in ECR, which is Amazon's container service registry. We've pushed our image successfully with a tag to that registry. And so that means that we are all set for next week. So next week, if you're planning on tuning in again, it's going to be pretty AWS heavy. So we're going to walk through how to set up our AWS account for our new ECS app. So we're going to set up a cluster. We're going to set up an application load balancer. We're going to set up a target group. We're going to talk about how target groups work. We're going to talk about health checks and how to health check our app. We're going to talk about security groups and how to get the right port in, and then maybe some best practices and stuff like that. And then, which should set us up, I believe, that the week after that we should actually be deploying our app. So the same container that we are able to run locally, we'll deploy that to our ECS cluster, and then we should be able to, if we've done everything right, be able to test our actually working app. I think there's some stuff that there's some extras here that hopefully I feel like we'll be able to cover a little bit about. So that there's some really cool stuff I think that's built into ECS from the beginning, and I want to make sure that we can talk about it because it's things that I think are really important for running things at scale. So stuff like auto scaling both your cluster hosts and the actual services, I think is really cool to cover. Lahorna01 says, is this streaming recorded? If yes, will it be on YouTube or some other site? Yes, it is recorded. Thank you for asking. As far as I know, they're just on Twitch right now, and I believe that the link was passed around a couple minutes ago. If by a minute, I feel like I might mean an hour. But the link is twitch.tv/AWS. So it's this. So you can go back and watch all of these streams, and you can watch them. You can watch them on Twitch. I'm not sure if they'll be made available anywhere else. I'll pass that message along. SlasherXF says, will we be able to test out what you deploy, or will it just be deployed privately? So that's a great question, actually. That sounds like fun. If people are interested, I think, in being able to actually test it out, yeah, I will certainly pass around a URL, and you guys can test it and then shame me if it doesn't work, which is also fine. And also, all the actual code and stuff for this will be on GitHub. So Randall's app itself is already on GitHub, so you can go and check out the code for is the 7 running. I'll pass around the link to the repository. But yeah, everyone will be able to test what we build, but we'll also test it together on the actual stream. So I'll go and hit the URL the same way that I did. The same way that I did for is the 7 train running, which is we ran the container and then we hoped for the best. I could have tested it out, I guess, without the actual browser and just kind of pinged the URL, but I think this way is more fun because I get my nice yes sign. Yeah, so that is what we've covered so far. That's what we're planning on covering next time. I think if there's any requests, so I know that we had the request to do some more stuff from the CLI. So yes, I think that's awesome, and we should definitely plan on doing that. Quantum Information says, great video. Hope to see you again. You guys will all see me again. You'll see me next week, also on Thursday, for part 3. So we will recap all the stuff that we've already done, but I will post around a couple of links again. Maybe I'll tweet them. To Randall's app, and then also to what we've done so far. So you should be able to see both the Docker file that we've already written, which I think the thing to keep in mind is that it's such a basic, we're working with such a basic app right now that you could really easily extend this to work on your own project. We'll cover up how to set up the AWS resources side of things, but we can pass around like a CloudFormation template for what we've worked on, and instructions for what we've worked on, so you guys could replicate this if you wanted. We will pass around the Docker file, and then since that app is already open source, you actually could go back and you could replicate everything that we've done in this stream on your own. And I think since it's such a kind of a basic, since we're testing with such a basic app, it's like a really easy next step, I think, to go back and say, okay, well, I have this app that I've been working on my own, and I want to Dockerize it. It's the same thing, because all we're really showing in these is, okay, so I have my process, and I have a bunch of requirements to run a process, and I have a process. But how would I actually get those to run together in a Docker file? And I think that's what we're learning here. So how to set up our environment, then how to run a process, and you can go back and you can apply that to kind of any process. Zaxan says, can we expect an ECS service without having to pay for the whole EC2 cluster? I'm not sure I 100% follow that question. AWS has a pretty extensive free tier. So I mean, you could have an EC2 cluster that was of T2 micro instances. So you'd have to. I guess I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. So right now in general, like there's a really extensive free tier. You can test out just about everything in AWS for free, or I guess for very little. As for changes to the ECS free tier, I don't know off the top of my head, but we love to hear feedback. So if you're looking for something specifically and you don't know that it's included in the free tier, definitely let us know, and we'll see if we can. I mean, we love customer suggestions, so maybe someone else has the same suggestion also. I will pass around the link also to the first ECS first run. I will pass around the link to the ECS first run wizard, which I think is what has been one of my coolest things to work with that. But basically, as for the pricing thing, there's no like additional. ECS is just part of AWS, so you could definitely run a bunch of things in just the free tier. If nothing else, we'll pass around a CloudFormation template. If you guys want to try that out, you can both you can spin up that stack and then also destroy it from CloudFront. So you can test things out on your own also. If there are no other questions, I am out for the night. But next week, same time, same place, we will be covering all the AWS side of it. If you have questions or comments or requests in between now and then, you can tweet them at me. Amazon passes out my Twitter all the time, but it's at Abby Fuller. So if you have any questions or requests for more episodes, hit me up. Another question from Zaxan, is it wiser to use Docker ECS to deploy applications instead of co-deploy? That's an architecture question, I think, Zaxan. So if you want to work with containers and microservices, then I would deploy, my personal choice would be to deploy them through ECS. But it's more about what you're trying to deploy though, right? So if you have just like an application that's not containerized, use code deploy. So the way that I was using ECS in the past is that I was building on I was working locally, and this was pre-Docker for Mac, and I'm dating myself, but it was pre-Docker for Mac. So I was running Docker inside a Vagrant environment, and I distributed that Vagrant environment. So I ran ops. I distributed that Vagrant environment to all the developers. So in order for them to work on the services locally, they ran the Vagrant environment. They could build and test their images in Vagrant, and then everything after that was through Git and CI/CD. So if I work on a feature, I test. I test it locally. I commit it to my branch. My branch runs branch tests. We were using Circle CI, but you could use pick your own. It's like choose your own adventures. Choose your own CI tool. I pushed my branch. My branch ran specific tests, and then I had two kind of deployment cases. I had a staging environment, which is an exact copy of my production environment, other than it had different databases and things. Commits to the develop branch went to my staging environment, so I built them. I pushed the tags to ECR, and then I deployed I basically updated my service with my new task provision ECS, and I did those all through the CLI. But it was my CI tool making the CLI calls. So that was part of the job as part of CI. So it would push those image tags, it would push them to ECR, it would create a new task revision, and then it would update my service with a new task revision. And we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this next week, or maybe actually the week after that. But ECS has this is my favorite feature, so I tell everyone about it, and I feel like maybe the ECS team is tired of me talking about it all the time, but it's my favorite. So task revisions for new revisions will never actually drain traffic off of the old revision until your new one passes health checks. So basically, if I deploy a revision that's not good, ECS, and it won't pass health checks, ECS won't even let me deploy it. I can try and deploy it, but it will never actually drain connections off the old task to switch over to the new one, which helped me a lot. But I could handle all of that in my use case from my CI/CD system. So it would create the new revision, then update the service, and then it would notify us. But like if it never went out, that was a Slack message for us. But I could keep track of my deployments that way, but it was all automatic. So creating all those revisions and updating them, and that worked really nicely. For us, since we had microservices, it was Docker and ECS. Anthony WC jumped in also and said code deploy and ECS are not comparable. They do different things. That is correct. ECS is for container management and orchestration. So I have a bunch of microservices. They're all containers. How do I organize and account for those across a cluster? And that's what ECS does. And then there's some other stuff built into ECS for things like how do I scale up those services or scale up the hosts, the EC2 hosts that make up my infrastructure. So that is what ECS is for. Code deploy is the traditional, like the CD tool. I think that like anything else, and I feel like I say this like 4 or 5 times an episode, but a lot of this comes down to do what you're going to use and be happy using. So I think ECS is awesome. So that's why we're talking about it on Twitch, is because that's something that I think is cool, and I want more people to learn about using it. But there's definitely code deploy out there. We'll probably won't cover it in this particular set of episodes, but if you have suggestions of things that you want to see, let us know, and maybe we'll cover them in a future episode. Impossible Monkey says, can I suggest a track for chill background music? I'd ask. I'm not sure if that would be distracting to other people that can't focus with music on, but I don't know, maybe sometime. I like listening to music. I feel like I'd get distracted though with like what was happening on the music, and then I wouldn't be listening to what I was actually doing. Toxisova says this doesn't need background music. Impossible Monkey, I'm probably not going to try this time, but maybe next time I'll have to ask and see if that's cool or not. I don't want to mess with the audio too much. Definitely pass on your suggestions. If there are no more ECS, ECR, Docker related questions, I will end this for today. Again, tweet us, email us, let us know in the meantime if you have anything that you want us to cover specifically. But next week will be an AWS extravaganza with setting up ECS and we'll set up a VPC, we'll set up ECS, we'll set up security groups, we'll do all that cool stuff, and we'll talk about application load balancers. But that's next week. Cool. So if that's everything, have a great day, guys. Thanks for joining me, and looking forward to seeing everyone next week. Bye.